Welcome to this presentation entitled Engaged People Engage People: Why Preserving Historic Buildings Isn't Enough. Hello, I'm Angie Lazarus, and I'm here today to consider how preserved historical buildings can best be presented to the public. My husband and I recently visited Mobile, Alabama, a city founded on the Gulf Coast in 1702. There we found 3 sets of historic buildings huddled in the shadow of Interstate 10. Around the new Mardi Gras Park stand the Anglican Christ Church, an Italianate red brick building that housed a doctor's office for more than a century, and what locals claim as the oldest city hall in continual use. The city council meets here once a year, but it's really today the home of the city's historical museum. Across the street, a partial reconstruction of the fortress itself anchors an area called Fort Conde Village, where a dozen restored homes comprise a lovely boutique hotel, complete with locally themed breakfasts. But our favorite is the Conde Charlotte House, a restored antebellum home right next to the fortress's southern wall facing Theater Street. This house museum presents the city's diverse history under 5 different national flags. The story of how this historic district came to be is a study in surprises, but what struck me was 2 radically different ways of presenting the past to visitors. When the French built Mobile as their colonial capital, the river was already recognized as a Gibraltar of the American interior. Commanding an array of inland waterways and international and Caribbean routes, Mobile was worth owning. Through most of the 18th century, it remained part of French Louisiana while Spain controlled Florida east of the Perdido River. In a world dominated by waterborne trade and imperial jealousy, Fort Conde was the heart and defense of colonial Mobile for a century. But in the 1960s, plans were laid for Interstate 10. According to the New York Times, all traces of the fortress had been lost because when the U.S. Army inherited the fort in 1821, it was sold at auction, demolished for landfill, and the land sold for residential development. Until the 1960s, the fort and colonial center lay largely forgotten under the streets of a growing port city. Hearing that a new interstate tunnel under Mobile Bay would surface in the heart of the old historic district, locals realized the exit was right on the site of Fort Conde. The alarm was sounded, but Conde's knight in shining armor was not a federal agency or a powerful financier, nor was it academic historians or archaeologists. It was saved by ordinary citizens led by Nancy Holmes, a transplanted school teacher from Kansas who discovered the city's history while working with a tour company. As she learned, she grew invested, joining more than a dozen historical and cultural organizations. Armed with an extensive network of contacts and her crown as the First Lady of Mobile, Holmes rallied the troops. Together, they lobbied for federal and state funds to support proper excavation of the site before its destruction. This was the best they could do. As ruins were revealed during a 3-year dig, public interest grew. The old fort would have covered 10 acres, almost the whole downtown area, so a full reconstruction was impossible. Instead, the city raised funds to reconstruct 1 quadrant of the old fortress on a 4/5 scale. Today, the site comprises a corner of casemate wall housing a small museum, a parade ground with a restored well, and a few cannons. At Fort Conde, the visitor tours at his own pace, relying on signs to interpret Mobile's complicated history. Inside, maps show the city in its various periods, and the fort's original building plan, which was found in an archive in Paris, helps visitors imagine the building's original layout. There is a key to explain the image. The museum also houses an exhibit about the excavation itself, a miniature cargo ship, a small sampling of artifacts like arrowheads, knives, pistols, jewelry, and most interesting, the seashells people used to ground to make building adhesive. But the museum's most useful displays are 3 model reconstructions of the fort in its different stages. The earliest one shows a rudimentary wooden structure, the one that the French had before 1720. And then there's a model of the British remodeling Fort Conde, which they called Fort Charlotte after their queen. Neither of these models has any explanation beyond a name plaque, so it pays to do your reading in advance. The third model especially needs interpretation. It illustrates a key moment in the American Revolution that most people have forgotten. In 1780, the Spanish took this fortress by blasting a man-sized hole through its western wall, depriving the British of British West Florida and access to the Mobile, Perdido, and Mississippi rivers. In many ways, the fortress fails as an educational venue. The displays are clear enough, but their significance is lost. For example, a corner containing two signs, a portrait of Bienville and a naked mannequin, is dull and confusing. For one thing, the mannequin is Caucasian, but it is supposed to represent Indian body painting techniques that Bienville described in his journal. In another room, perched on a pile of luggage, a tiny plaque lists the founders of the first Canadian settlement in French Mobile, 1706, which they called Les Oignonnais, onion fields. This is a tantalizing detail, especially to me with my Acadian heritage, but without a docent to answer my questions, I couldn't understand its significance. Around the corner from the fortress, the National Society of the Colonial Dames of America has restored the antebellum Conde Charlotte House as a museum. The original house was actually tucked between the fortress's southern bastions, and in 1822, while the fortress was being demolished, it served as courthouse and city jail. In 1849, master builder Jonathan Kirkbride bought the house and, using the old jail cell's doors and foundations, designed the house that remains today. The Conde Charlotte House has served as a courthouse and jail, residence, Depression-era boarding house, and World War II officers' club. Today, the museum is furnished with carefully researched pieces so that visitors can feel something of how daily life changed during French, British, Spanish, American, and Confederate rule. An immaculate white picket fence and yard surround the old house. In the middle of the front door hangs a brass, massive door knocker and a small notice that says, "Knock loudly." A docent welcomes each visitor, ready to walk them through 2 centuries of Mobile's history. One day, my husband visited alone, and Carmen Kearley was there to guide guests through the ground floor and courtyard. When he expressed an interest in the archaeological dig, Mrs. Kearley went searching for something, but more of that anon. On the first floor, 2 Confederate-era parlors flank the entrance hall, the larger one graced by a portrait of George III above the fireplace. The room's folding library table and gentleman's secretary desk, complete with hidden compartments, bespeak a time when correspondence occupied a part of every gentleman's day. In the smaller parlor, 3 period chairs face a reproduction of 19th century French piano. Another door opens to a tiny private sitting room whose original Dutch brass chandelier spotlights a glass panel in the floor. Underneath, a showcase displays jail artifacts recovered from the foundation, a shackle, a metal bowl, and iron knuckles. Situating these artifacts beneath the house reinforces the timeline. The jail remains were buried under Mr. Kirkbride's house. Just through this sitting room is an American federal dining room, a step backwards in time. This room feels ready for its mistress. The dining table and 8 chairs gleam in the filtered light, and a man-sized silver cabinet displays a collection of silverware and serving dishes, ready to be used. She even has a hostess mirror in the corner just in case. Across the courtyard, a reconstructed kitchen and servants' quarters bespeak the hidden business of cooking and cleaning. Like most historic kitchens, the artifacts are a study in resourcefulness and ingenuity. My husband's favorite item, for instance, was a thin iron bar whose ridged end was used as a toaster. Rising through the home's central hall is an old staircase. At the top, a late colonial wedding dress faces a portrait of Spain's Carlos III, the king whose army took Mobile away from George III downstairs. Surrounding the landing are 2 French and 2 American-style rooms. The French bedroom captures the imperial aesthetic with a small sleigh bed, a nightstand and chamber pot, a precious antique rug, and a mirrored wardrobe. In the sitting room is a 3-compartment travel case outfitted with specially built drawers for a lady's necessaries, her jewelry, her sewing kit, and her stationery desk, complete with ink and quill. In a corner, Bonaparte's portrait hangs over a small Spanish guitar. Here, docent Lucille Badger told a story of Bonaparte's brother Jerome, who married and sailed away with an Englishwoman, but only to be called back. One somehow feels real people live here. I can picture, for instance, at the marble card table tucked in a window, a couple playing whist together while their son picks a tune on the guitar and their daughter reads a letter aloud. If a historic home should give visitors a sense of the past, this room makes that past feel real. Across the hall, the simplicity of the Kirkbride's American-style bedroom stands in contrast to the French style. A swinging bassinet at the foot of their low bed bespeaks a different set of concerns from the French family in their parlor. A small lady's desk and a gentleman's shaving table stand in opposite corners, ready for business. Through an open doorway is a room furnished with a child's bed, its mattress tied to the frame by a rope, with a trundle bed tucked underneath. A washtub before the fireplace, as set as if it were about to be bath time. This room opens on a small balcony overlooking the home's jewel, a Spanish garden, complete with running water. The garden's clean design and bubbling fountains would be a pleasure viewed from above. Its cross-shaped brick path separates neat flower beds. The fountains are a tribute to the Spanish who tapped fresh springs to provide safe public fountains inside the city. From the balcony, Miss Lucille pointed to her own home. She had grown up beside the fresh springs whence this water came. Personal connections like these give the impression of a people who feel their own past and want to share it with you. It may sound like this house is full of a confusing heap of stuff, but in reality it seems much less confusing than the sparser artifacts at the fortress. Since the Conde Charlotte House has a clear mission to educate the public, its staff presents not a bunch of artifacts, but a story told through household items displayed as they might have been used. As its website declares proudly, docents are committed to imparting its history to visitors, offering tours which last between 1 and 2 hours. The result is not a confusing array of stuff, but a cultural chronology that immerses visitors in the ever-shifting family life in a city under 5 flags. The docents also give visitors a taste of Southern hospitality. In fact, my husband spent several hours discussing the house's educational work with the 2 volunteers. Their dedication made it natural to ask questions. In sharp contrast to the fort's presentation, the house is actively interpreted to teach and entertain its guests. Before Ben left, Mrs. Kearley showed him what she'd gone in search of: a photo of 2 perfectly preserved olive oil jugs found in the tunnel excavation. Her own passion for a good dig site lit her smile as she confessed that she and her husband had excavated the backyards of a few houses themselves. These 2 ladies, a writer and a teacher, know and love their history, and they love to find someone they can share that history with. Historical preservation is important. It keeps material remains available for both the academic and the public to enjoy and study, but that is not enough. If education is the goal, then hospitality and engagement with the public are as important as the actual preservation is. A restored site containing an incoherent collection of artifacts merely confuses the visitor. Careful arrangements, labels, and signage help, but the visitor still only has facts to go with things. The tough and expensive truth is that no site can fulfill its educational potential without human interaction. Each visitor, especially the one who happens by with no prior knowledge, depends on both careful presentation of buildings and artifacts and on passionate humans with sound training and a friendly smile.